I think.
Great. Hi, and welcome to the Isolation Working Group meeting for today. The last meeting we had was 2 weeks ago, and at the end of that meeting, we reached the point where we were going to go through and decide what all of the individual items were that we needed to consider and how we were going to look at very specific actions for each of those different types of events. Today, there looks like there's 3 things on the agenda, so let's get started with that. The first one, there's been an issue that was pinged to me during the week, and I just wanted to get the group's opinion on if this should be part of the working group's remit, given that it seems somewhat similar to the way that it seems somewhat similar to the decision we needed to make about the Redis cache performance. We decided that the Redis cache was out of our remit because it's more to do with the scaling of an individual item, not so much about, like it's the performance of the system as a whole, not necessarily going to be subject to noisy neighbors in that regard. And I was wondering what the opinion of others was on this.
I'm thinking, Rachel. I'm just trying to look through the issue, so there's a dramatic pause.
No, that's fine. I don't expect that everyone has read the entire issue before joining the call. So,
I mean, it does seem related because you're talking about sharding based on groups. So in a way, that's a form of isolation. It seems related, although I would want to more deeply read the issue.
I think, like, the way I read it on a high level, because I also have just browsed it, is that the size of, for example, gitlab.com actually limits the feasibility of running Elasticsearch in one cluster in general. And so that just makes the entire thing not very performant. So the solution to that is potential sharding and isolating specific groups. And I think that sounds related to what we're trying to accomplish here. So maybe, like, if this is a worthy thing to do, which I don't know if it is, right, then that could be part of a recommendation saying, for Elasticsearch, actually, we recommend doing this, or maybe something related to address performance concerns regarding search.
Well, that, and I mean, I guess, do we have controls around searching other people's projects? Like, for example, if we had a company that wanted their projects to be isolated, I assume that they would need to be in a different search index.
I think that also is in bordering on the compliance and data isolation aspect, which I think we were going to talk about as a separate item, or that was going to be as a separate thing from this group.
So I think what I want to say in the short term is that we are on the side of adding it. I think where my head's at is I think it is part of this. What I'm struggling with is do we need a consistent form of isolation for customers? So, like, if a customer comes to us and says, I want to be isolated, you know, do we have a consistent way across all our services, or, you know, is it different on each one, or how do we think about it? And that's kind of what I'm currently wrestling with. And right now, my short answer is for good customer experience, it seems like we'd want to give them a minimal number of not minimal number of options, but a number of options such that they felt like they had the flexibility to be isolated, but at the same time, it didn't have to be different for every single service that they potentially would use within the GitLab overall a product, right? So from that perspective, it seems like this should be included, if only because we have to figure out, because, like, let's say we shard based on, I don't know, project. We start sharding based on project in a customer, and we do that for one product, but then another one we just do it strictly on customer ID or user ID or something like that. To me, it's going to lead to a lot of complexity, or at least for the customer to understand, it's going to lead to a lot of complexity for them to potentially understand it, particularly when a particular system fails, because that's usually when they want the isolation. And that's kind of, at least my current thought is is we need to be kind of consistent. So because of this should at least start here.
Okay, well, I'll add the working group label to this so that it can get managed on the boards as well.
And I think actually, now that you say it, Christopher, I think one thing that you pointed out is that when we talk about isolation, what services do we actually mean, right? Because I think it's not only Postgres, right? There are other things as well. And so I think that's maybe an interesting concern, because I would say as a customer, I would like to know, when GitLab says, hey, we are isolating things for you, what does that actually entail, right? And ideally it should just work out of the box and affect, the like major services that could be disrupted, search, and so on and so forth. So I think that makes sense to me. And
just to I kind of caught it hopefully there, but like this is like my initial reaction kind of thing. If folks have different data or something that points to something different, then that's something we can definitely like that's kind of feedback, and then we could potentially push it out. But yeah, it feels like this should be included until we have a good, at least minimally, like it'd be nice for us to have a kind of heuristic or some kind of criteria to say, okay, like here's how we're gonna, like new service pops up, completely new services, how would we want them to be from a customer experience perspective?
Sure, that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering how like, are we planning on actually marketing isolation as something that we're offering? Because to me, if we're talking about isolation from the standpoint of just minimizing blast radius from our perspective and helping maximize customer experience, but like that seems like a different strategy from, hey, we're offering isolation as a service or something. Because then, I mean, like you said, the story needs to be complete from my perspective. And like in terms of that good customer experience, if they're buying isolation, like it needs to be really clear about what they're getting and why those services were isolated and why it matters, I think.
Well, I think we decided as part of the previous meetings that we're talking more about blast radius and noisy neighbors and the performance of the system rather than offering isolation as a service to customers, because it was decided that, the opinion at least was that customers at the moment are requesting this because there are availability problems on the system. And if the availability problems are seen to decrease, it might actually not be something that they request anymore, or they request it for entirely different reasons. So I think we need to proceed along those lines, that we need to be focusing about the blast radius and the availability of the system rather than offering isolation as a service for this group. I mean, we may get to isolation as a service towards the end of the life cycle of the group, but I think for now we need to keep that separate. The next item on the agenda, as part of the action items from the output of the last meeting, I went through a significant number of the RCAs to see what kind of issues had come up, what had caused them, what the root causes were, what the impact was to customers. And as I've said there, in some incidents, only part of the system went down, which shows that there's already some level of isolation in place. For example, there was one where it was only people who were using CI runners that were impacted. But what I've learned from going through these is we need to go even further into each of those pieces of the system and figure out how to partition them in some way. And I think that an appropriate next step is to go through the system and find out what all of those pieces are. And I'm sorry that Andrew is not on the call, because I was going to ask him if he would be the appropriate person to talk to go through the system to find out what all of these different pieces are. Initially, we thought if we found all of the incidents, we'd be able to figure out how to effectively address each of them. However, all of them had corrective actions, and the majority of the corrective actions are done. So I think that I'm trying to find a different way to approach the problem, which I think is now looking at the specific components and what the impact is of them going down.
To me, that sounds like a really sensible idea. And also, we could, I think maybe somebody's already suggesting that, creating an issue or an epic and then actually grouping things under that. Because I think it's probably the discovery piece of work to say like, okay, what pieces do we actually have? And I think then it's also identifying potential corrective actions for each one of those, right? Maybe Elasticsearch is one of them.
Yeah, that's a very interesting discussion. So I'm new to this working group, so let me introduce myself. I'm Grzegorz Bizon, working with Nicolas on serverless in the system team. And yeah, I think that's the very interesting problem we are trying to solve here. And it's not entirely sure for me what the problem exactly is, except of scalability problems, availability, and performance. And I know that we do have Scalability group working on a similar thing. So perhaps can someone explain me what's the difference between what Scalability group is working on and what the isolation working group wants to achieve? One context I can add is that Scalability team is driven by metrics, and they are data driven. They have dashboards, and they make decision on how they want to re-architect GitLab based on data, and how can we do similar thing in this isolation team to actually avoid optimizing things that won't make a huge difference.
Sure. Well, I can answer the first part of that, where you're looking to understand the difference between this group and the scalability team. Excuse me. So in my mind, the scalability team is concerned with the performance of the system as a whole, making sure that there are no bottlenecks that are here or immediately on the horizon that need to be addressed, and looking about how to service all of the things that GitLab needs to do as a whole. Whereas what isolation is looking at is when something happens that's unexpected, either a planned upgrade, a noisy neighbor event, or something else that happens that just isn't something that we anticipated, how can we prevent that from being a widespread outage across the entire system? So how can we correctly create and install fences in different places of the system so that if one part of the system has a negative event that happens, the whole system doesn't go down, or not all customers are impacted, or just try to minimize the impact of any incident that happens. So is that a clear enough separation of the two concepts?
Well, it is. However, in my opinion, this concept is a subset of what Scalability team is working on, probably. I'm not saying that should be Scalability team responsibility to work on isolation, but it is closely related in my opinion. And yeah, but it explains, it answers my question, so thank you very much.
Yeah, just to add a little bit of additional color, Grzegorz, the Scalability team this is a working group, so the idea is we set up to come up with the high level concepts, we push it to the right teams to work on the issues, and then we disband. Scalability team is a team. It has resources assigned to it. It actually picked up some great talent from the development team, unfortunately, for me, outside of being moved out of the team to basically go work for that team, which is great because we need to fix those problems. The other aspect I would say is Scalability is really focused on observability as well. So how do we best make sure that we're analyzing to basically detect conditions? And I agree that they have to be complementary, and we can't be working against each other, obviously. So we need to make sure we understand what they're attempting to do as well. If it turns into that it's a subset of the work and it eventually ends up in the Scalability team, that's great, but they're just getting started as well. And it was viewed as we needed to run this in parallel, basically to try to push for some things. In particular, the database team is a good example where the DB teams outside of the Scalability team, they probably need to short the database at some point. We should have a consistent message on how we want to basically go about this for that and other services within the GitLab product as well, or .com, I should say, as well. So we definitely need to be aware of what they're doing, and we need to make sure that also what we're doing works well with what they're intending to do.
And also, if we come across issues where the overlap is very much unclear, then as there was an issue that came up in the meeting last week, then I'm getting in touch with Marin, who's the engineering manager for scalability, and just asking if he feels that their team is more appropriate than this, or vice versa for that. So just trying to be sensitive to the fact that both groups exist.
In some ways, we're pushing the work to where it needs to go. Some of that work may go to the scalability team, it might go to the DB team, it might go to specific product teams. It really just depends on what we discover and where we think the problems are. Kind of getting back to the high level, Rachel, I think this is a great idea. Can you set up the framework with either an issue or an epic, and then maybe the list of RCAs, and then the other part of it is people who would be willing to volunteer to basically help with that, because I have the feeling it's a fair amount of work to go through all of them. So I don't want you to feel like the burden of that. I feel like that should be something we should distribute. Any volunteers, or do I need to?
Well, I'm already halfway through. I only have about 20 left to do, so it's not a problem for me to go through the rest of them. I think where the bigger assistance would be is starting to look at the services or the single points of failure, as Nicholas has said here, the single points of failure in the risky areas. I think that's somewhere where I need more assistance, as it's less clear from both the RCAs and in actual fact from the architectural diagram what those are. So that's why I was hoping to spend time with someone who's got all of that preloaded in their head, being Andrew, to just pull it out in a form that is already quite digestible. So I think what I might do is just set up some time with him anyway to go through those and produce from that a list that we can either turn into a series of issues or add it to an epic in some way to communicate that out, and then we can take it from there. Okay,
cool. If you need additional help, it sounds like Nicholas is interested in helping, or at least I saw a smile on his face. So.
Yeah, I'm happy to help out.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah, and given that I am literally, technically quite useless, I can probably add some epics and help setting up the structure because I can open issues. It's a key product manager skill.
Thank you. It's a very good product manager skill. Thanks so much, Fabian. There is a question here around investigate options for using Q namespace to partition paid customers' background jobs. That sounds interesting. It's unfortunate that Andrew is not able to attend today.
Yeah, Craig actually put this up as well. It feels like this is a good example of isolation.
Right, because I'm pretty sure that they can delete, for example, if we had things namespaced in the queue that you can delete based on the namespace. So if a particular user creates a whole bunch of jobs that we want to nuke, this would allow for that, because I think right now it's keyed by, it's not keyed by a namespace.
So this is a good example of Fabian, which is he has two options in here. One is free and paid, and I mean, if we have noisy neighbor impact in the free space, but it wasn't affecting our paid customers, is that an acceptable option? Or because I think option one is obviously simpler, but I have the feeling it's going to be problematic at some point.
I think this is probably something where we need to be a little bit delicate, right, in terms of who we, how people become aware, that there's sort of preferential treatment in their queues, and be very explicit about that. And I think, yeah, I don't know what the right way forward is at this point. But you could, for example, say, and I've seen that before in products where, if you are in a specific tier, right, you get your own namespace for a specific job, so you can expect them to finish in a specific time. But I think I would agree that's probably a product decision. I think the namespacing it in general, right, to be able to then eliminate someone who just opened 5 million jobs, right? I think that's also a slightly different issue, right? I think that's generally probably quite good idea. I wasn't aware that isn't actually possible. So I learned something.
Can you share this with the product team? It feels like this is a good example where getting feedback would be useful.
Absolutely.
To help with it. Okay.
I won't be able to make the product meeting tonight, but I will share it in the product channel and say, hey, this came up in the working group. Because like I agree that, let's say the implementation is probably technically totally fine, but if you want to, have different treatment of queues depending on, where people are in their licenses, that's, I think, a product decision. And my 2 cents, I think that is probably a little bit delicate. That tends to get people worked up sometimes.
Great. Well, thanks for taking that to the product team. That will be great to get their feedback. The next item, Ramya, would you like to vocalize that?
Sure. So my point is more towards having a plan to break the system rather than actually fixing things. So I was just thinking about how we could periodically have a list of things that might break if we have a service going down, or maybe because of isolation issues. And this is one thing that came to my mind, like chaos engineering, wherein we wantedly go and bring down a service, or maybe Gitly is one of the things that we are currently working on, and maybe that is a good example. So one of the tests that we are adding for Gitly HA is like we bring down Gitly and then we see how GitLab as an application, how it actually handles that. And so that could be like one of the examples. And I was actually thinking maybe this could be in line with this discussion. So I thought I would just share this as well. And another thing that comes to my mind, which is in line with this, is something called the game day, which usually happens in few companies, right? And I think I had a chat with one of the persons from infra team, and he said like they are coming up with something similar. So all of those things could actually help us to identify such things. I mean, we could identify it by ourselves rather than waiting for an event or an incident to happen, basically. So just wanted to specify that as well. So
I think that's a pretty good idea, and it actually would align quite well with the idea of identifying all of the different services that could be problematic and the points of failure, and then actually including on each of those issues what a test scenario would look like in terms of having to bring it down or flood it. So that I think that's I'll take that on board to include that as part of the issues that get raised. I might also ping you for some help there, just for the correct wording to put into each of those so that it makes more sense.
sure.
I actually think I remember seeing a code. I think it was code written by Andrew that builds some chaos endpoints into GitLab Rails, and we do have this already in parts of the application that we can simulate problems and load and all the stuff. So we are kind of doing something like that already with GitLab Rails. Of course, we have other services that might benefit from having chaos endpoints, let's say that way.
Sure, that would be nice to know. I haven't done much analysis on this. So if we already have something in place which is like similar to this, maybe then we should have a way to run it periodically and have the results reported, and just have that process in place as well.
The one aspect with Chaos Monkey that we'd have to decide as an organization and have a real initiative against, I don't know if it would be part of the isolation working group, is a lot of organizations where they start with is they just do point testing. Basically, they do this like in staging. And Netflix is the only organization, well, I'm sure there are other organizations, but I don't know of too many organizations that actually run this in production. Like that's one of the things that if you talk to Gremlin I talked to Gremlin about a year ago, through another life, and basically their feedback was yeah, we are really encouraging customers to use this as kind of like an initial like wade into the water, don't just immediately throw this into production. So we just want to make sure that if we're doing this, we're thinking about it. But Chaos Monkey is also the like across all things like node failure, all these other things, but like the one aspect that they do think about is noisy neighbor kind of interactions, which is kind of where we would get the isolation. So I think it's a good path for us to go down. Let's just make sure we're doing it in the right places.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and its repeatability is interesting, at least from what I've seen.
Right. Is there anything else that anyone wants to talk about since we're at the bottom of the agenda and we still have a couple of minutes?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah. I just wanted to make the one point around the chaos engineering is that is a product area that I believe configure orchestration is supposed to be like eventually working in. So maybe there's opportunities to kickstart that effort there.
Sorry, I was a tiny bit distracted writing up a response for the other issue already. I think highlighting this to the PM in that area is also a good suggestion, just to get their input and see what their thoughts are on it. So I would agree with that.
So just as an aside, I'm going to the page. I'm looking at the criteria. Do we think like we're working towards the exit criteria, or do we think we're still forming from that perspective? So as an example, development has scoped and sized the most important item for incremental execution. Product has prioritized the most important item for incremental feature delivery. Quality has scoped and sized the most important item for regression validation. So I think the RCA stuff will definitely help with us to figure out what the most important item is, and then we just got to figure out how to then get it scoped and sized. So it feels like we're making progress, at least from my perspective. Folks disagree with that, or is that kind of general feeling of most folks?
I think from my perspective, I would like to have a little bit more concrete, these are the areas and these are the things that we can concretely do. And I think once that is available, we can also have at least from my perspective, you can say like, okay, what do we believe is the most impactful change for the smallest amount of work? And I think if we can put that in issues, then hopefully we will get there sooner. At the moment, it still feels a little bit abstract, but I think that the plan of doing it is solid from my perspective, if that makes sense.
From my perspective, if I had to open my laptop, browse issues, and find one issue that I'm supposed to work on to improve the situation, reduce the noisy neighbors and all the stuff, there is nothing I could probably work on right now. So I would say that we are still working towards finding what we need to do.
Okay, that's good feedback. Let's see how that RCA analysis helps with that, and see if we can scope that from that perspective. Makes a lot of sense. Cool.
Well, I think that's a good goal to set for the next meeting. So I'll get in touch with Andrew and set that up, and I'll put in the agenda for next week how we get on with that. Great. We're at the hour, so thank you very much all for your time today. And yeah, I hope to see you on the chat channel during the week. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.